I grew up in the Northwest, way out in the country, and I'd go out in the morning and come back when it got dark. So I grew up outdoors in the woods. We would walk across these old railroad trestles. There were these giant wood structures that sort of came out of a hillside, went across a ravine, and then went back into the hillside. And the idea of the straight line kind of cutting across this sort of organic, natural shape and the power of those wooden columns and everything had a huge influence on me. I'm really interested in architecture being sort of one big continuous environment. The climate, the landscape, the building, the interiors, the furniture, the art, it's all one thing. And I think every piece affects every other piece. I see the world that way. I see just about everything that way. That certainly shows up in my architecture, where the inside and outside flow together, where rocks are sitting on the dining room table just like the rocks on the beach. Even in our Pioneer Square apartment, some of the furniture on the inside of the living room is intended to relate to the buildings that are outside. It's all about tying things together. When I went to Egypt, I found probably my greatest inspiration. The heroic architecture, the great grand scale, the integration of art into every inch of the architecture. I'll never forget walking down the grand aisle at Karnak, and I felt like a god or something. It was just an amazing experience. And having almost the opposite experience of going to Japan, this exquisite detail and sensitivity to nature and the framing of sort of organic nature. In a sense, what I do is I sort of draw on both of those two traditional cultures at once. The sensitive detail of the Asian culture, but also the simple monumentality of the Egyptian structures. As a young beginning architect, I was lucky enough to meet Paul Kirk, who was one of the finest architects of the Northwest. I was beginning to learn about the international style and Mies van der Rohe and Gropius and those people. But what Paul Kirk did is take a lot of those ideas and turn them into kind of a nature-loving architecture as well, using those simple lines but with natural materials, and for the purpose of really, being part of the environment as opposed to standing out from the environment. That is something that has stuck with me very much. This cabin, in many ways, it's like a little nest. The intention was to have it feel like it had always been here in this woods and was part of it. The trees were growing right up out of the sides. The colors come right up off the beach and out of the woods. It is a lot like what an animal would build in nature using the materials that are available. When you're inside the house, it's all about looking out and experiencing nature in different ways. The windows are all designed to sort of look into the woods and frame nature the way we might frame art in a different house. In the back, you can lie in bed and look up, and you look into the treetops from below, and you might see an eagle go by or a hummingbird or something, and then at night you see the stars. By underlining nature that way, you really see it much better. I loved as a kid, and still do, lying on my back in the woods looking up through the trees with the sunlight hitting the leaves, and you get that wonderful, soft, glowing kind of green color. We have lots of very straight fir trees in the Northwest, and they almost form sort of cathedral-like spaces in the woods with light beaming down through and all that. All those kinds of things you just learn by observing nature. I think a flower in nature is really interesting because flowers need to contrast with their surroundings so the bees can find them, or the hummingbirds, because that's how they survive. Say a little white flower or red flower up against a dark green background just really pops, and it kind of inspires a way of presenting art that really allows the art to kind of come to the foreground. I feel that architecture should serve art because I think art can be about imagining things without any limitations, and we learn a lot from art because of that. James Turrell is an artist who probably influenced me more than any other artist. The idea of sculpting light and using actual light as a medium. So architecture can be inspired by art. Then there's architecture that creates an appropriate background for the art. This kind of neutral color becomes the perfect backdrop for pieces of art that might really punch. It's a little bit like framing the painting. The wall is actually an extension of the frame. Then there's art where art becomes the environment itself. A mural or a detail. For instance, in the living room in my apartment, the walls basically wrap the room and they're a mural, and you actually feel like you're sitting inside of a painting, and actually you are. So sometimes art can take over and the architecture kind of takes second. You know, there's a lot of different ways, and nothing's either right or wrong. It just all depends on the situation, and in a way, the whole thing is just endless, just like nature. It goes on and on and on, as much as your imagination can think up. Every project really starts with the client. And part of my job as an architect is not only to solve the functional things, but to try to draw out who people really are and try to represent them. The client's opinions and sensibilities and things are really important because, after all, the project is an expression of them. So they're part of the creative process all the way through. And while I'm going off by myself and discussing and brainstorming with people in my office, I'm also doing that with our clients. And our clients usually remain friends for life after we've been through this kind of a thing with them. Sometimes when I'm agonizing over how to get started on a project, I'll just go for a few hours and walk through a museum. I've done it at the Seattle Art Museum, the Henry, and even MoMA in New York. And I just wander through and look at things. And when I walk out, I have my concept. I actually become inspired by paintings. And I think the combination is really what an architect is. It requires a tremendous amount of discipline, but it also is a very artistic and poetic kind of thing. Because in order to do good architecture, you really have to be patient and disciplined and systematic, but you also have to have some poetry to make it all worth it. I think that architecture is kind of an extension of ourselves and our bodies and our minds. If you look in nature, say a bird's nest or a beehive, they're basically ways for that creature to survive in the world. They're made by the animal, but they're also kind of part of its being. And it's like our clothes are the same thing. We need clothes because we need to keep warm. But clothes are not only about keeping warm, they're also a way of expressing yourself, kind of who you are, how you present yourself to the world. And architecture is the same thing at another scale. It's protection, it's shelter, it's prospect, refuge, and all that. But it's also your little message to the world as to who I am, what I believe in, what I think is important, and all those things are also architecture. One thing we've always done is build buildings that will last for a long, long time. If you can do something that people will want to save and preserve for hundreds of years, that's the best thing you can do. I think architecture really has a huge effect on everybody. We're in it all the time. We go from one space to another, and a beautiful, nicely proportioned space with wonderful light coming in can be inspiring. If we can create beautiful places for people to spend their lives will take on more meaning, and it can actually make people their very best selves.